Parles-tu français? Hablas español? Parli italiano? If you've used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based techniques teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world. With lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers, Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/Wondery. Spelled BABBEL.com/Wondery. Rules and restrictions may apply.
What can 160 years of experience teach you about the future? A lot, especially when it comes to protecting what matters. At Pacific Life, we've helped people and businesses confidently embrace the future with life insurance, retirement income, and employee benefits. With strategies built on strength and trust, and a promise to be here for you today and tomorrow. Ask a financial professional how Pacific Life can help you today. Pacific Life Insurance Company, Omaha, Nebraska, and in New York. Pacific Life and Annuity, Phoenix, Arizona.
From 1989 to 1995, Nurse Kristen Gilbert murdered 4 of her patients at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Massachusetts, and she's suspected of killing dozens more. On Mind of a Monster, a podcast from ID, criminal psychologist Dr. Michelle Ward dives into Kristen Gilbert's twisted mind to try and find out why she killed her patients and how she was able to do it in front of her colleagues. She speaks with detectives, journalists, nurses, and victims' families to unpack Gilbert's life and crimes on Ward C. Listen to Mind of a Monster, The Killer Nurse, wherever you get your podcasts.
You see it in those movies, and you can do this with anything. You can go back to the early 20th century when you have this massive influx of immigrants. And there were a lot of people who didn't like that. It was sort of a dark period, both for racism, anti-immigration, natalism, all that stuff. And you see people like H.P. Lovecraft who are tapping into that with his very sort of xenophobic horror that is all about these sort of outside forces, right? Who are awakening and destroying what we've built as humanity, right? And you see sort of the channeling of all these sort of social tensions into things that don't, on their surface, are not that. But if you think about them at all, you see that developing there. And it's really interesting the way we do and have continuously and continue to this day to create myths, to create monsters, to embody our fears, to teach lessons, like we said with the Wendigo. And something that whenever I'm looking at horror, I'm always seeing like, what is the sort of underlying subtext, which a lot of times I don't think the creator even realizes.
That's Brett Talley, an author of several best-selling novels and anthologies, including He Who Walks in the Shadows, That Which Should Not Be, and The Fiddle and the Devil's Instrument. Brett is also the host of the highly rated true crime podcast, The Prosecutors Podcast. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Last year, Brett and I discussed why we love mysteries and the Dyatlov Pass incident, and what has become an October episode tradition. The year before, we discussed the way that we see the world through horror. This year, Brett is returning to talk with me about the monsters we make, whether it's werewolves, or zombies, or Slenderman, or the Algonquin malevolent creature known as the Wendigo. Folklore, horror stories, and other storytelling includes a host of monsters that often cross time and culture. They often appear at moments where we in society are ripe to learn a particular lesson. That's why I thought it would be interesting to have Brett come back and discuss some of these issues about the monsters of our own creation. Brett's been twice nominated for a Bram Stoker Award for Superior Achievement, the top award for horror writing presented annually by the Horror Writers Association. That Which Should Not Be was Brett's first novel, and it was published in 2011. In addition to being nominated for the Bram Stoker Award for Writer's First Novel, it was a semi-finalist for the Goodreads Choice Awards and a winner of the Journal Stone Horror Writing Contest. That Which Should Not Be takes readers on a journey to Miskatonic University, a fictional school with a widespread reputation for being connected to the occult and the supernatural. There, a professor and a student search a nearby village for a book that's believed to control all the non-human forces that rule the earth. The pair bring the book back to Miskatonic University, opening a gate to the netherworld. Brett was also nominated for a 2014 anthology, Limbus Inc. Book 2, that he edited, where 5 masters of horror, fantasy, and science fiction told stories about a world of time travel, human sacrifice, intergalactic beings, and more. Brett is an attorney and also the author of several true ghost stories and a nonfiction book called Haunted Tuscaloosa, which explores the paranormal in the Alabama town from a now shuttered local insane asylum and antebellum mansions said to be haunted by ghosts, to cemeteries where Confederate soldiers are said to still march, and ghost stories from the University of Alabama grounds. On the Prosecutors podcast, Brett and his co-host, Alice LaCour, explore some of the mysteries of true crime, including strange disappearances, some of the big true crime cases of the day, but they also go beyond that. Often, Brett and Alice help bring clarity to things that seem mysterious, like their exploration last year of the murder of Ruthie Mae McCoy, which inspired the 1992 movie Candyman, and their exploration last year of the story of the man who inspired the fears of razor blades and poison being in Halloween candy in the episode The Man Who Killed Halloween, Sweet Dreams. Brett and Alice go beyond what might traditionally be considered true crime and have explored unexplained mysteries like Dyatlov Pass, where 9 Soviet hikers died under mysterious circumstances in the Ural Mountains, and the Kymar-Dabain incident, where 6 other Soviet hikers disappeared in the mountains near Lake Baikal in southern Siberia. They also have done other topics, like the humanoid creature reportedly seen in the 1960s in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, commonly known as the Mothman. The Prosecutors podcast was the 2023 winner of the People's Choice Creator of the Year Award at CrimeCon. This October, they're tackling some twisted cases, including that of Richard Chase, the real-life vampire of Sacramento who put Dracula to shame, and the Slenderman myth and the murders that followed. Today, we'll be talking in the first of 2 episodes about the monsters that we make. So, Brett, I just wanted to thank you for joining today for this tradition. I think it's now our 3rd year of doing an October episode, and I know you love October. I love October as well. You know, last year we got to do, we got to do Why We Love Mysteries and also Dyatlov Pass, which is my favorite. It still remains my favorite prosecutor series. Not that you haven't done good work since then, but there are not many stories as good as that one. And then, or at least mysteries that exist are as good as that one. And then we did, we looked at, sort of the way we see the world through horror. And I thought it'd be really cool today to look at some of the monsters that we create, and I'm not thinking about it just as writers or, but just as society. And I just think it's a fun, interesting topic that tells us a lot about, ourselves as people.
Yeah, and I'm really great to join you again. This is one of my favorite traditions, as you said, in October around Halloween, to get to talk to you. So I'm really excited. I love this topic. I love pretty much any topic that has anything to do with horror and Halloween. And I feel like we always have such great discussions. So I'm looking forward to diving into this one.
Yeah. And it's, it's interesting. You often talk about how some people drop off during October, but I get so excited for the October episodes of your podcast and thought it was just such a cool. I remember in the first year that I heard it, it was so unexpected to me that you were doing them. But I really love it, and I really enjoy those things. Part of the reason why I picked this topic for today, or was thinking about this topic for today, actually comes from the podcast. And I was thinking about some of the episodes you've done, like the Mothman Prophecies out of West Virginia. And then even, some of the characters that you had in your book, Thou Shalt Not Be, like the Wendigo. And, it's one of my favorite, I think, characters in mythology and horror. I could probably spend the rest of my life studying it. It's different sort of creations across like the Cree, the Ojibwe, a bunch of other indigenous tribes, slightly different names, but essentially a malevolent spirit that's associated with things like famine and winter and cannibalism and that insatiable hunger. And sort of like the Candyman lore, I kind of think of that. You should be very cautious about saying its name.
That's right.
But and I find the Wendigo interesting too, because once the Wendigo is there, you're in a lot of trouble. But it seems like it's a metaphor for things, almost a protective metaphor for things like not walking alone and staying connected to your community, practicing generosity, things like that, and restraint. Because it feeds on excess and selfishness and all that other stuff. And even there are elements there, I think, and it actually comes out in your book, things like respect for the land and respect for the spirits. And, one of the things that I was really thinking about along those lines is how monsters, whether it's in literature or in life or in folklore, can really be moral lessons for us. And I was wondering what you thought about that.
No, I think that's right. I think if you look at the monsters that inhabit our folklore, that sort of dominate our past, a lot of times it's not so much that they come from fear, but it's more a lesson. It's an embodiment of something that we value. And you mentioned the Wendigo, and that's such a great example because you have these people, the Algonquin-speaking people in Canada, who are living these very austere lives. They're hunter-gatherers. They depend on being able to find food. They depend on working together. They depend on sharing what they find. And there's this notion in that culture that greed and gluttony and thinking selfishness is a real danger. There's a great story about how in the Ojibwe people, I think in particular, at some point with a child, they would be offered a piece of food and a piece of charcoal. And if they went for the food, they would be admonished. Whereas if they went for the charcoal, they would be praised. And the whole idea was you need to be willing to sacrifice your own needs for the good of the group, because if you don't, everyone will perish. And the Wendigo was this physical, spiritual manifestation of that greed, this idea that if you lost control, if you did something like went against one of humanity's greatest taboos, committed cannibalism in a time of famine rather than working together to survive, you would be taken over by this creature and tortured for what you did. And so just this, we have to avoid that at all costs. And it really came to dominate the fears of people, but it was for a good purpose, right? And I think you see that in so many different cultures in so many different ways, where these creatures that we normally think of today as sort of sources of fear and, things that we have fun with around Halloween, at the time when they were developed or when they were really thought about, it was very much about that moral value in the community. And that's always been something that struck me.
Yeah. And there's this sort of balance, right? Because I think of some characters, you brought up the Algonquin speaking indigenous people and the Ojibwe. They have this character, it's Sabe, and it's sort of like most associated with like Bigfoot and Sasquatch. And on one hand, like the underlying idea is that Sabe is closer to the spirit world than humans. And there's this phrase like he who walks tall. And it's meant to sort of like represent and to teach ourselves and others, right? That if you're honest in your dealings then your spirit will be as big as Save or Sasquatch for Bigfoot. And, but one of the things that happens, though, the flip side of it is that if you don't listen to Save, you run the risk of losing your integrity, sort of like creating disruption of the balance within the community and yourself, and then becoming spiritually vulnerable. And I kind of think, a lot of the monsters that we create are almost designed to manage internal things inside us that community can't necessarily on its own manage, that it's really something that you're carrying yourself, and that the moral lesson being stuck in your head is a great way for you to do self-management in the place where the community can't do it alone. Does that make sense to you?
No, I think it doesn't make sense. And I think there's this understanding that we all have, no matter what circumstances you're looking in. I often think of the Constitutional Convention and this whole notion of if men were angels, they wouldn't need government, right?
Right.
And I think there's a similar thing at work there. We all are, we're animals in a very real way, right? Like we have a very base nature that can dominate us, and we see it dominate people who are sort of outside of society, who become outlaws and criminals and who do horrific things. And I think when you're raising children, you're trying to impart morality on them. A good way to do that, you can tell them, it's sort of the whole, you can tell your kids to do something, but until, you can tell them the stove's hot, right? You tell them over and over and over again, but until they touch the stove, they're never really going to know. And you hope that telling them is enough, but usually they have to sort of encounter the danger before they really learn. And I feel like these stories and these creatures are sort of a middle ground, right? It's more than just saying, hey, you need to be a good person who thinks about others, who shares, who understands that, you can't be selfish. You have to be thoughtful. You can say that, and you can try and impart that in that way, and maybe that takes. But usually a much better thing to do is to tell stories, to have allegories, to have fables. And we see that in every culture across the world. These, even if they're not horrific creatures, just sort of like Aesop's fables, right? I mean, these stories that teach us a lesson and that we can grab onto. I mean, the best Saturday morning cartoons did that. I remember growing up and you would learn things.
G.I. Joe.
Exactly, right.
Knowing is what?
Half the battle. And I feel like there's a lot of that in there across cultures. And it is a really powerful way to teach lessons through more than just, do as I say.
We're spending more than ever. I hate my job.
The price of everything has gone up.
AI is threatening my job.
It's crisis after crisis.
Nothing is working out.
I can't find a job. We're one disaster away.
Take control of change.
I need a change.
Disruption is the force of change. Stop the chaos. Stop the madness. Take control. Read James Patterson's Disrupt Everything and Win.
At Arizona State University, we've made online education better, smarter, and more personalized so you can go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 350 plus programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
It's kind of an interesting thing, that point that you're making. In a weird way, these stories, fairy tales, allegories, even the monsters within them, they kind of meet us where we're at. Like, you reminded me of this story. And, when I was growing up, I remember I was like a little kid. I don't know how young, but I went to my uncle's house in Denver, and it was a big trip there. I do not remember a bloody thing about the house, but I remember this chest of drawers that I'm going to tell you about. My brother and I go into this room, and it's in the basement, and my uncle closes the door, and then he opens the door again, and a little light comes up, and he tells me of the boogeyman that's on the shelf, and that if little kids get up, the boogeyman is going to come and get them. And I do not remember a thing about the neighborhood. I don't remember a thing about the house, but I remember that bookshelf.
Yeah.
And I remember waking up that next morning and making sure the boogeyman wasn't there. And so I sort of think of it, with what you said, like maybe those stories kind of meet us where we're at. Because if my uncle had come in the door and said, "Hey, Jason, there's a lot of importance to REM sleep, and you really need to get deep sleep to truly for sort of like nearer in the long-term benefits," I would have been like, "All right, whatever."
Yeah.
So I wonder whether there is something about that, both in what it does for children, but even for us as adults, when we're trying to understand the sort of fragility of reality or things where we're not going to be able to get answers, whether these sort of stories and these tales sort of lead us in the right direction for ourselves and our communities without having to get into all the complexity of the full lesson.
And I think sometimes I think we think that folklore and these kind of tales are really for children. And I do think that is a mistake. Like, I think there are lessons for all of us in a lot of this stuff. I mean, my kids, they love to listen to the original Brothers Grimm stories. And man, those are brutal. Like, I'm like, you sure you want to hear this? Like, in Cinderella, the sisters are like cutting off parts of their feet to fit them in the glass slipper. I mean, this is some brutal stuff.
Some
going
rough
on,
stuff.
Hear it. Yeah, but back then, these weren't kids' stories, right? They were for adults, and I think you see that if you think about more sophisticated fables. I mean, one of the most sophisticated fables is Frankenstein, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you think about that story and when it comes along and talk about meeting us where we are, meeting society where it was. It's in the Industrial Revolution's going on. Science is replacing religion. There's this whole notion of we can do anything. And then you have this story that grabs onto that and talks about it, not in like a polemic, not in some sort of diatribe in a newspaper.
Not Ted Kaczynski's manifesto.
Exactly. Right. But through a story, an allegory, the one that stood the test of time. And that to this day, even if you're thinking about, I mean, think about how timeless that story is. Even if you're thinking about AI today, right?
It's funny you say that. I just saw a story that used that as an example.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, there you go. And that's, once again, these are complex issues. They're difficult issues. They're hard. And it is so much easier to conceptualize them, to think about them, to analyze them through fiction, through, in this case, horror, than it often is to sit through a TED Talk on it, right? So, yeah, I think these stories, they're great for kids, but there really is a value for all of us because, frankly, I feel like we've become a little less deep thinking than maybe we used to be. Yeah. Maybe that's like a recency bias. Maybe people were always like that. But I just wish we could grapple with big ideas more. And I think maybe doing it through these mediums that we love are the way to do it. You know, one of the reasons Jordan Peele, his movies that he's been doing recently, like just such good movies that tackle big issues, right? And do it in this sort of framework of horror. And I love to see that. And I really think it's good for all of us to be engaging with those ideas.
Yeah, because what movie was it that I saw recently? And I'm not going to be able to put my finger on it, but it was about a Black family and community growing up in the South during Jim Crow. It had all sorts of neat elements, like the Choctaw from Oklahoma who were involved, but there was a creature in it, and it's going to come to me in a second. But there was a creature in it who was one of the white members of the community where there may have been sort of like a peel of racism around them in the Klan, but he was actually sort of like egging the community on, and he was a vampire. Mm-hmm. And it was such a great metaphor. You can see it from the beginning when the Choctaw are warning the people in the community that there's a vampire somewhere out here. And it ended up being an entire metaphor for, at least in my mind, the people who were taking advantage of Jim Crow to not just purely out of racism, but to sort of line their own pockets and other things along those lines, and how to overcome the vampire. And it was really neat because it sparked conversations that I had with other people who had seen the movie, but they didn't necessarily grow up in the South, and they didn't know a lot about that. And being able to have conversations with those metaphors, it made it more relatable for people. Even people asking me, why were there indigenous people in there? And me being able to tell the story of how the indigenous people actually helped the Irish during their famine, and, the story of the Scots-Irish coming over, and all this rich history was so much easier to discuss around something creative like that.
That movie's Sinners, by the way.
That's right.
And and that's another great example. And I think that traditionally these stories, whether they're oral traditions or things that are written down, or now we have movies, even video games, right? I mean, there are all sorts of different art forms that can deliver these messages. And I think if you sort of view society, and we talked about this a little bit before, and whatever the challenges are that we're kind of grappling with, we tend to develop these stories, right? We talked about the Ojibwe, the Algonquin people dealing with famine, dealing with the taboo of cannibalism, and you have the Wendigo who was there. Well, we have that in the modern era as well. Like, you can trace horror through various things that have happened. The sort of in the 90s, when we were kind of living through like a Roaring 20s Part 2, if you think about it.
Yes.
Horror was kind of moribund. It was kind of dead, no pun intended.
Kind of flat compared to the 80s, where we had like Freddy and
Exactly. There was
Jason.
Very little going on. Then you have 9/11, and you have this boom in horror because it's a reaction to our fears and to this new challenge. And if you think about the 80s, what is society what is the moral panic of the time? Is you have this Generation X who they're not, they've thrown off traditional morals. They're having all this sex. They're doing all these drugs. And so what are your horror movies about? They're about a bunch of teenagers doing things they shouldn't do, and they get punished for it by the boogeyman, as you mentioned earlier, in the form of Jason and Freddy and, whichever, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, whichever embodiment of that same spirit, you see it in those movies. And you can do this with anything. You can go back to the early 20th century when you have this massive influx of immigrants, and there were a lot of people who didn't like that. It was sort of a dark period, both for racism, anti-immigration, natalism, all that stuff. And you see people like H.P. Lovecraft who are tapping into that with his very sort of xenophobic horror that is all about these sort of outside forces, right, who are awakening and destroying what we've built as humanity, right? And you see sort of the channeling of all these sort of social tensions into things that don't, on their surface, are not that. But if you think about them at all, you see that developing there. And it's really interesting the way we do and have continuously and continue to this day to create myths, to create monsters, to embody our fears, to teach lessons, like we said with the Wendigo. And something that whenever I'm looking at horror, I'm always seeing like, what is this sort of underlying subtext, which a lot of times I don't think the creator even realizes. I think it's something that they are tapping into that they're not even aware of.
Yep. Yeah, where they're seeing something and they're trying to wrap their head around it, but by the time they're even done or making the point, they may not have even realized what they've created. Like, I think of something like, jumping back to Mothman, this actually kind of ties into one of the things that I definitely wanted to ask you about. You often talk about the idea that, sometimes listeners will drop off during the October months for the horror episodes, or not horror episodes. That's not even fair. They're October true crime episodes, but I like to call them the horror episodes. But but people will drop off, and a lot of them are just real true crime stories, like the story of Ruthie McCoy, the Chicago woman who was, somebody broke through her medicine cabinet and, killed her. And then that led to the Candyman story, or the actual Candyman, as I will call him. I cannot remember the guy's name, but it was a guy in Texas who tried to poison his son with cyanide-laced Halloween candy. Yeah, pixie sticks, which led to this whole notion that we have of check your candy, which is not necessarily a bad thing to do. But,
True.
It actually, it pans out that way. And I was kind of thinking, these really are like normal true crime stories. But then I thought about the Mothman prophecies. And part of what I thought about the Mothman prophecies, did you guys do 1 or 2 episodes on that? Something like that?
One.
Yeah, you did 1 episode. Now you would have done, 20, maybe? Right, at least 20. But something like the Mothman prophecies is kind of interesting to me, because some of the things that I sort of take out of that, and I mentioned some of this before, is like the fragility of reality, right? That because John Keel is the guy who investigated it all. And it was happening in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in the 1960s, I think. And there were all these sightings of this large, giant moth creature with a large wingspan. But kind of what I took out of it, and maybe it's the part of me that's like, that works and thinks about psychology, was that fragility of reality, the limits to human understanding of things, and the toll of the unexplained. And it just, part of me, it baffles me how people who are interested in Ted Bundy, Brian Kohberger, and Israel Keyes struggle with those kinds of episodes. But when I think of that last part, our difficulty, the toll of having to think about the unexplained or have things that are unresolved, we can convince ourselves, even though it's probably not true, that we understand Israel Keyes or we understand Ted Bundy, as much as it's not like us. But I think we really sort of struggle with these things that leave questions about human understanding. Does that make sense? The idea that piece sort of frightens people?
No, I think it makes perfect sense. And Alice often talks about in various contexts that you are attempting in life to make sense of the world, right? And she often talks about sort of building a box around your mind, and there are just certain things that if you think about them, they'll destroy the box. We were talking about this with a case that we did recently that actually came out today, where we just didn't go into a lot of the details of what happened because they were so horrific. And Alice talked about how, if you're out there and you don't know about this, you've never experienced this, then it's up to you whether you want to learn about this, because if you do, you risk sort of destroying that box that you built around reality so that you can get your arms around it. And I think it's a similar thing that you're talking about in a different way. So with the paranormal stuff, the stuff like the Mothman thing, the things, as you said, that sort of challenge your conception of reality, I think there are 2 types of people, at least. It's probably more than that, but there are people who just don't like any of that stuff because they're really just materialist. That's the way they view the world, and they don't even want to think about that. Now, that could be for several reasons. One could be because they think it's a waste of time. Or there could be this sort of deeper psychological point, which I think you're kind of tapping into, which is if you consider that stuff and you allow it to get into your brain and you start asking questions and you start doubting, then all of that faith you had in the material world can start to crack. And that can be something that really bothers you on a deep sort of existential way, right? That maybe you don't even recognize. And I think a lot of this, as we said earlier, a lot of the way people think about things and they grab onto things is entirely subconscious. They're not even really aware of it. And then I think there are people who like the supernatural because it actually gives them more order in this very strange way. And we've talked about this before with conspiracy theories, that people like conspiracy theories because it's better to think someone's in control, pulling all the strings, than that things can just happen, right? Like, it is more comforting for some people to think that the United States government pulled off 9/11, that they have the power to do that, than to believe that a bunch of random terrorists halfway around the world can get through all of our security, all of our intelligence agencies, and commit a crime like that. Like, that to them is more shattering than the notion that the government did it. In some weird way, the government doing it is comforting, right?
Well, because it's our government that's protecting us that can keep a conspiracy. And the American government is great at many things. Keeping a secret?
Keeping a secret is not one of them.
No.
But if you look at Mothman, so, in that case, you had all these people who were seeing these weird things. And we can argue until the end of time about whether they actually saw those things, whether it was kind of mass hysteria, whether it started off as a joke by the first few people, and then you just had people seeing Mothmen everywhere, right? But what we know for certain is people saw these things, and then subsequently, about a month later, there was a great tragedy in that area. There was this bridge that collapsed and killed a bunch of people. Really horrific thing that happened. And then you had people sort of backwards looking, attaching the two together, saying, well, the Mothman, it was a prophecy. It was a prophecy of doom. And if we had only understood, we could have avoided this tragedy, right? And I think it's sort of an interesting psychological thing, because then you think, well, we really are still in control. Like, yeah, this horrible thing happened, but we could have predicted it if only we saw the signs. So we should do better next time, right? Not just a bridge can just collapse on you randomly because, a bolt broke. Like, it was as simple as that.
Yeah,
right?
It brings order to the world in a way. It makes me think of, so when I was younger, when I was a teenager, probably, I think I was late to this book. It had been out for a while, but I don't know if you've ever heard of Frank Peretti, the Christian author. Mm-hmm. He wrote this book called This Present Darkness. And then I think he had a follow-up book to it as well that was really good. And, for a teenager, and you're going through all these sort of like internal struggles about like faith and good and bad and who you are and impulse control stuff, like being able to see something as like spiritual warfare and angels and demons. And, and I know the book was probably a New Age critique as well, but also faith and resistance. It was a way to sort of like simplify this, right? Like, the world is a lot easier to think about if the temptation that I feel is coming from this character called the devil and his demons, if that makes sense. And then, I think as you grow and you mature, you may realize, okay, a lot of that is inside me and I need to manage, but I don't think as a teenager I could have really easily understood it. So in a way, it gave me more order, weirdly. If that makes sense. Introducing me to more demons kind of gave me not even that maybe I'm fighting something inside myself, but it gave me something to fight tangibly, if that makes sense.
No, I think it does. And I think it's an interesting thing, because you're right. And once again, if you can manifest your fears and you can think of your temptations in a way that you can oppose them, and think about the world in a way that's ordered even in its disorder, I think as a Christian, I think that all things work for good for those who love the Lord, right? I mean, that's what the Bible says. And that's a very comforting thing, particularly when bad things happen, because you know that, oh, look, this bad thing's happening to me. This is a really difficult time, but I'm going to come out of it. I'm going to be better for it, whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very comforting thing. It's comforting to feel like everything that's happening is part of some sort of bigger plan, that it's not all just chaos. We mentioned H.P. Lovecraft before, and one of the sort of deep horrors of Lovecraft is that none of that's true. That, we're ants, basically, and just completely at the mercy of a world, not just a world, but a universe that doesn't hate us. It just doesn't even care. It is completely indifferent to our existence, and we could be wiped out by, Cthulhu having a temper tantrum tomorrow, and there's nothing we could do about it, right?
Cosmic indifference scares me way more than demons.
Horrific. Exactly. Absolutely. And there's this notion of being adrift in this sea of darkness with a billion trillion galaxies around us all, and none of it cares. I mean, that is horrific. That is horrifying. Far more horrifying, as you said, than the demon who we can fight and who we have assistance in fighting, right? When you think about, as you said, spiritual warfare.
Yeah, and that's the thing about Lovecraft. He sort of like flips all of it, and I don't know whether I'll have anybody else who's like that. I agree with completely down with the notion, he paints us as fragile, right? And we are. Paints us as deluded. There's a fairly strong argument for some of that sometimes. And that, but also there's this string through his writing, which is basically this, which is like the anathema to the way I find peace in the world. I was telling someone, our friend, Julia Cowley, I was telling her that my comfort zone is to have things make sense to me. It could be crazy. The reason could be nothing I would ever embrace. But if I can put the pieces to the puzzle together, I'm like, cool. But the thing about Lovecraft, I think, is often in his writing, we're actually destroyed by truths that we're not supposed to know. And that concept to me is frightening. So then what am I supposed to do, HB? What exactly am I supposed to do?
Yeah, and he would say live in ignorance.
Right.
That was his thing. You live in this placid sea of ignorance. And if you venture out of it, you will lose your mind, because you will then realize all the horrors of the world. And to me, that has always been, that's why I always have loved Lovecraft, because that is the most terrifying thing to me. And I think when you think about horror, in the same way that we talked about how myths speak to different people in different ways, horror, what scares you is probably going to be related to whatever your deepest held beliefs are. The thing that challenges those is going to be the thing that is most frightening to you. And in this world, I really feel like a loss of control, this notion that we don't have any control over things, is something that terrifies people. I think that's one of the reasons you see the zombie apocalypse stuff, right?
Right.
There's this notion of there's just this massive problem that no one can stop. The governments can't stop. They all collapse. You can't stop it. And in fact, if you're not careful, you'll become part of the problem.
You'll become part of it. Yep.
Yeah. And then you'll be an enemy of your family and everything you love. I mean, that's really horrific when you grow up in a world where everything is controlled, where we, particularly in the United States, the dangers we face are pretty ephemeral. They're easy to sort of hold off, right? Then you have something like 9/11 happens, and I don't think there's any coincidence that that's the zombie thing just explodes after that. I mean, for the next decade, it's zombies everywhere, you know? And you have the 28 Days Later and the Dawn of the Dead remake, Walking Dead, all that stuff just goes crazy. And I think you see that, and it's a reflection in that fear. And as we said earlier, I think that's why conspiracy theories have become so popular, because they are, and I think they are more popular now than they were before. I would love to have someone tell
some
me
kind of researcher.
Right. Yeah. It certainly feels like there's a conspiracy theory for literally everything that happens, but I think that is a way to manifest control over chaos, because it's not chaos, it's planned. And so even if it's bad, even if it's evil, it's still planned. It's like you said, the spiritual warfare aspect. Yeah, that's bad, but we can fight that.
Yep. There's a roadmap. Right.
Yeah.
There's a roadmap for it. And it's kind of interesting. I was thinking as you were talking about the zombies, one of the key parts of the zombies are you can get infected by them, but also, to your point, underlying all of this is blindly following things, right? And that's another important lesson of life, that even things that you love or that you believe in, be careful about blindly following them. And that there are all these good lessons that we pick up from them. And I can also understand at the same time why we might want to run away from these concepts or ideas, particularly the ones that hit closest to what our fears are. But it kind of makes the argument, actually, we should maybe take a step toward the things that we fear a lot, because that's probably where we have the greatest opportunity to learn. And almost learn in a way that is less brute than someone directly telling you. Do you know what I mean? Like a fairy tale about lying is probably going to be better than the other version that somebody gives you about lying or whatever it might be.
Well, it's also better than facing the consequences of it. Like,
true.
That's when people often ask, why do you like horror? Like, why would you want to watch things that are scary? People ask the same thing about true crime. They like, why is it that women love true crime when women tend to be the victims of crime? And I think part of it is facing fears, facing problems in a way that isn't dangerous. It's almost like, why do people like roller coasters? Because you can experience falling without dying.
Right.
There's a similar thing. You see the horror, you see the challenges, you see potential pitfalls you could have, you see things that could happen to you, but you're not in danger. You're learning from the metaphor, from the allegory, from the fable, and you're doing it in a way that can be helpful. And you talk about zombies. It's kind of funny. Talks about the Wendigo, the zombies. They have a lot in common if you think about it.
Yeah.
Whole cannibalism aspect, and the fact that the only way to defeat them is to work together. Like a lone survivor in the zombie world is going to die, right?
Yeah.
You have to band together. You have to be unselfish. You have to help each other. You have to work together. There's always somebody in the group who's the selfish one who ends up getting a bunch of people killed, right? So a lot of the same lessons are coming through in this modern sort of incarnation of the evil cannibalistic spirit that takes over people and turns them into monsters. So
I remember back when I was in high school, I was in a high school journalism class, and I was in my senior year, and my teacher, for those of us who were seniors in the class, gave parting gifts to everybody. And she gave me, someday I'm going to have to go ask her what this was about. But because I remember her saying, I thought this would be perfect for you. But it was a little book of all the fairy tales, the major fairy tales, Cinderella, Snow White, all of them. But it was the non-American Rosie version. It was the original version. And I remember reading those and being like, these are not what I consider fairy tales. They are horror stories. They really are. I think the difference between a horror story and a fairy tale, I'm not exactly sure, because they usually in our telling end with a happy ending or a lesson at the end of it. But I remember reading Hansel and Gretel and thinking to myself, there's a great lesson in there about getting trapped in, you think about the gingerbread house, trapped in things that feel beautiful in the moment, but are dangerous. And then I walked away after reading the real version of that, really thinking, things like, and this stuck in my head for years. Like, I can't tell you how many times I think about this point. The idea of loyalty and mutual protection that come out of it, that idea of deceptive appearances that's in it, the idea that adversity is a part of coming of age and other stuff like that, that I think I probably learned lessons that I carried on into my life without even realizing it was in the back of my mind, if that makes sense. Like, these things stick. Maybe the boogeyman doesn't stick as a guy on the shelf, but it sticks as a life lesson in a different way about, like, taking care of yourself or fill in the blank. Does that make sense?
I think fairy tales and fables are right up there with the Bible on having influence on me. I don't know if you ever read, you were probably, I always forget exactly how old you are, and I'm not going to ask you how old you are.
Deceptively young looking.
Exactly. You're deceptively young looking. I wouldn't say over 29. But there was these books.
My mom was 29 for 50 years.
There were these books that came out, I'm gonna say maybe late 80s. I don't know exactly.
Okay.
Called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Was that something that you ever encountered?
Yeah, they existed. Yeah, they were around when I was growing up. Yeah,
Okay.
I probably just a little bit younger than me in terms of age group, but
They were
yeah.
3 books with these like horrific illustrations. I mean, just amazingly terrifying illustrations. It's kind of hard for me to believe that they let kids look at that
And
stuff. But anyway,
they were controversial at the time, as I recall. That's it was Alvin Schwartz or someone along those lines.
I mean, I don't remember who it was who wrote it. I don't know if he or if the people actually would really nice to find this out. So now I want to do that. But like, are these collections of stories kind of like the Brothers Grimm? Did they make them all up on their own? Like, where did this stuff come from? I don't know, but it was like modern fairy tales, right? And they had these sort of horrific consequences. You know, I remember one that was it was about bullying in my mind. And it was all about these brothers who they create like a scarecrow basically, and then like bully the scarecrow, which sounds weird, I know, but they're like bullying the scarecrow. Well, then the scarecrow comes to life and enacts his revenge. And like the last scene is one of the brothers is running away while the scarecrow is like tanning the skin of the other brother. Like, yeah, on the roof, because that was the kind of stories these were. And yeah, like those stories have stuck with me. Like you were saying, I read those when I was a very much younger than I probably should have been. I mean, grade school, right? But I just remembered and have never forgotten them. And they have stuck with me.
And I could have told you as a little kid, or somebody could have told me as a little kid, you know, Jason or Brett, be very, very careful, about making fun of other people, because, you don't want to dehumanize them, and you never know what's going on inside of them, even if they aren't saying anything. And you could have gone on for like all day long. However, a story like that, message received. Okay, I think we can stop here for this week, and we'll be back next week with the second episode. Thanks for joining Brett and I for this first of 2 episodes on the monsters that we make. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all again soon.